Hello, and welcome to A Weekend with Good Friends. We're certainly glad that you could join us. I'm Miranda, and I will be moderating our panel today on modern horror. You probably know me as a cast member and storyteller over on the Old Ways podcast, but really, honestly, that's enough about me. I would much rather you hear from our panelists today. So, why don't we start by going through some introductions, and we'll start with Anthony.
Hi there, I'm Anthony Lee-Dudley. I'm an occasional writer and an even more occasional getting paid for writing person that occasionally puts things out for Call of Cthulhu. I've written for Chaosium, Cubicle 7, and a few other things. I write short stories which appear in things like Blasphemous Tome and Hypergraphia and Proto-Dimension magazine. I'm very interested in the modern horror. Oh, I also podcast with Grizzly Peaks. I've been told I have to say that.
Do you get paid each time you say it?
No, but I get to go back next time.
Okay.
They let me do it at 3 a.m. my time as well. So, I mean, who wouldn't want to do that?
Very generous. And James?
Yeah, I'm James, also known by my brand name of Groundhogger. I publish small games by myself on my itch.io page and just through other platforms. And I also run games. I've been running games for the last 40 plus years. So I have some experience in doing so.
Just a little tiny bit of experience,
Just a
right?
little tiny bit of experience.
Khaldoun?
Hello. Hi, my name is Khaldoun Khelil. I write and develop role-playing games, written on the newest Dune game and Vampire the Masquerade, Vampire the Requiem, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mummy the Curse, Mummy the Resurrection, Cthulhu Awakens for Green Ronin, some other Green Ronin projects. I guess my first RPG book was writing on Cairo by Night a million years ago, and I've been writing RPG stuff ever since. Yeah.
Very cool. And Richard?
Hey, I'm Richard Ruane. I run Our Rook Studio and have published Roseville Beach, and I'm currently publishing The Haunting of Cliff Cove. I got my start writing with RPGs also a million years ago, doing stuff for White Wolf, mainly as an editor, but occasionally as a writer.
Very cool. And Ambrose?
Hi, everybody. It's me, Ambrose. I go by she, they pronouns. I am the creative director and founder of Other Sider Studios, which is a channel that focuses on horror and investigative horror. I got my start with the Lovely Craftians podcast, which we are on season 4 and transitioning to season 5 soon. I can't tell you when, but I know it is underway right now. I am also an award-winning TTRPG performer, specifically in the horror genre. Oh, sorry, hold on a second. Jesus Christ, sorry. Like I had like something blow out my speakers just now. Jesus, sorry.
And that was my cat. Sorry.
I was just like, ooh. Award-winning TTRPG performer for a best player in a Chaosium game. And I believe that would be the Lovely Craftians podcast. That is me. Y'all are phenomenal, and I cannot wait to talk with you about the thing that I love most, which is horror.
And modern horror at that. So that brings to mind our first question, which we'll kind of go all around and all share about this. And I joked about not calling on you, but I am going to call on you. So Anthony, I'll have you start, and then we'll kind of go around. So you're just the first victim. But what is modern horror? I know it's a very broad question, but what makes something? I was just moderating a panel on science fiction and post-apocalyptic horror, and we kind of talked about how that's modern, like we're living that now. And when we think of Call of Cthulhu, we think of 1920s, 1930s a lot. What makes something modern horror?
It's when it's horror in modern times.
Thank you.
That's okay. I suppose there is. It's going to be an evolving state because modern is an evolving state. But something that takes on board the realities of the time in which the horror is being set, I would guess, is as good a description as I can come up with. So something that has to deal with the modern life that we're all living, if it's in a realistic setting. Things like cell phones and computers and the internet, and things like that, which make things very different from playing in the 1920s and 1930s if you're playing Call of Cthulhu in traditional times. So that's my take on it.
James?
We can't name an era until we've lived through it. So modern horror is the label we give to the current era until we know how it's going to be looked back at. So as Anthony was saying, we can look back at Victorian horror and Edwardian horror and identify the themes from that era, the things that people felt deeply fearful about. We won't know really what people are going to name this era until later, but we call it modern horror, and it's about all the collected themes of this contemporary era that we're living through now. The technology, the political shifts around the globe, globalism, in a sense, becomes a major fear in this era.
And they'll call it the pre-apocalypse.
Khaldoun, what makes something modern horror for you?
Yeah, my answer isn't too different than everyone else's, I guess. But the main thing is right. It's horror that explores, what we are living through on some level. Whether it's as simple as a setting, basically using terms and things that we're used to, such as like a modern American city or something along those lines, or more broadly, tackles issues that are pertinent to us today. That's kind of what I prefer to do when I do modern horror. I definitely want to tackle issues that are pertinent to our modern lives, not just the technology or whatnot that makes our modern lives what it is.
Yeah, it's the type of question that gets harder to answer the more people have already answered it. So, Richard, what makes something modern horror?
I'm going to jump in and say, like, if you're doing investigative horror, modern horror begins, and that's not all RPG horror is investigative horror, but it's a big part of the RPG horror space. Modern horror begins in the late 90s as cell phones and the internet become to dominate like the ways we do all sorts of information gathering, including preparing to travel to gather information. Like you can't really sort of figure Mask of Nyarlathotep and all the work you do in Mask of Nyarlathotep to get across the globe in a year in a modern way, because beginning in the late 90s, booking travel becomes so easy and a thing that actually starts to put travel agencies out of business. Thankfully, I was never a fan of travel agencies. But yeah, and I think that and then we also begin talking to people and gathering information. By the mid-aughts, we get the capacity to do video calls in the hands of just everyday people. So I think that's when I would begin to talk about modern investigative horror. I think you can go a little bit backwards if you're doing something that's not so focused on investigation, but I think modern investigative horror begins in the 90s.
And the 90s are an interesting period for modern horror because it's 30 years ago. The mid to late 90s are 30 years ago. And I mean, I remember getting a cell phone in the early 2000s and how much different that experience was to even the experience I have now. But some of those obstacles to modern horror start to come up around that time period and the things that you face. And we'll kind of talk about those obstacles more as we progress. Ambrose, what makes modern horror for you?
Oh, you finally got to me. Hi, everybody. So what, to me, modern horror is introducing the horror element or the creep factor through the elements of things that we trust on a modern day-to-day situation. So we trust our phones, we trust our internet and technology to tell us the information that we need. Um, Going back to investigative horror, yes, like that's how we start gathering information. We don't just go to the library and gather it that way. Like that was something at the time to do during the time. But then when you introduce modern technology or the day to day, the things that you trust, can you really trust them at the end of the day? Is a good example to bring in that horror, right? So if someone is watching your calls, for instance, or uh, using technology against you to find out more information about you, is it someone you can trust or not? Stuff like that, I would say, is modern horror. Bringing in the horror with our technology and the things that we deal with on a regular basis is how I see modern horror. And that evolves and changes as new things progress year after year. So that's another example of what modern horror is to me. At the very least.
Yeah, I think the next question kind of piggybacks off of that really well, because you brought up some of that with, being monitored and things like that. What are some of your favorite themes or tropes that come up in modern horror specifically that you bring into your games?
What I love, and if like this is a continuation for me, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, anyone. Go for it.
I would say that my favorite trope specifically is the evolution or the creation of what is it called again? It is urban legends, because those things are made and generated through the internet at rapid pace, and you don't know if it's real, you don't know if it's true. Like the more outlandish it sounds, the more unrealistic it might seem, or something that might seem like it's very true might not be true at all. So the creation of that and how it evolves over time, people add on to it, and then maybe it used to not be a real thing, and because everyone's belief is behind it now, becomes this looming, terrifying thing that can be introduced into whatever media to tell the story. I would say that. So generating a monster through the masses is my favorite trope, personally.
Can I jump in there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a absolutely fantastic idea. I think sometimes we look at modern horror and we look at the ways of getting round the obstacles of modern horror, and we don't look at the ways that we can use modernity to create horror. I wrote an article for Hypergraphia magazine, which, if you ignore the incredibly purple prose at the beginning of it, for a few years ago, was something that I was quite proud of. But unfortunately, no one ever read Hypergraphia magazine, so it got lost. But one of the ideas I had in that was the internet is another dimension. We're used to talking about, we talk about portals to other places, to the dreamlands, to other dimensions in certain ways. The internet, that whole area is another dimension. So if you look at the vitriol and things that can be created in echo chamber type web places, it gives birth to some kind of gestalt entity which exists within that environment and then breaks free. So you get a bunch of people all around the world. The only thing that they have in common is that they are members of the same chat room, and then suddenly simultaneously 1,000 people stand up around the world and do something really strange, and they're all trying to get to a place where if they get there, something will happen and this creature will get through because it's come back through. So finding those areas where the horror is because of modernity, because of the technology, that's the bits that really interests me. Likes, people click on likes almost without thinking about it. Spells are often cast in games by people giving us proportion of their life energy. So what if each like was a tiny piece of energy that was given to this creature, and you get 1 million likes and something goes viral, and then suddenly you've got a creature with all of this that, and no one's even noticed anything because they've given this little tiny weeny piece of energy. So.
If I can jump in, Anthony A, I immediately almost forgot what I was going to say and immediately thought of like so-and-so. There have been 14 reposts on the Babylon working. And was just like how happy that would make Jack Parsons just off, But I wanted to piggyback on something Ambrose said about sort of the urban legends, because I think 10, even 15 years ago, the most interesting horror component of conspiracy theories is what if the conspiracy is real? And now we have shifted to conspiracy theories spreading virally very aggressively. And the most scary thing is not whether the conspiracy is real, it's do a dangerous number of people believe in the conspiracy is the most frightening thing about conspiracy theories kind of online right now. And I think that is where we're seeing technology sort of become sort of a source of horror in ways that not like early science fiction didn't even really talk about. It's more about like, oh no, it's the communication, people talking to each other, that is the frightening.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that as well. I'm currently in an ongoing game of De Profundis, which is traditionally an epistolary game where two players just write letters to each other. But we're now playing that through a Discord thread. We've agreed on the fictional nature of the world before we started, and are then trying to stay as immersed as possible throughout. And because we are consciously doing this, we're acting out the roles of people who are in a Discord thread discussing the subject of the server they're all members of. A lot of stuff is entering into that about fake news and AI generated footage, where we're sort of being drawn down the rabbit hole step by step through our own posts. And it's becoming more and more conspiratorial. We started off this very innocent idea of like, oh, here's an old cartoon that somebody's found on the internet. Wouldn't that be interesting to look at? And step by step, we've questioned the reality of the cartoon. Was it actually made in the 1930s, or was it a modern fake? And we've just gradually accreted all these layers of lore by ourselves with no outside input, no agenda, nobody trying to drive it to a story point. We are acting like a group of people talking through ignorance largely in a chat and just coming up with our own theories of what explains this oddity, this ambiguity about the media we found.
Yeah, I guess building on the discussion, I'd say that a trope I particularly like in general is the haunted house. And what makes a haunted house interesting is it's a space that you usually consider your own or safe. You have some ownership over it, and suddenly it's betrayed you in some sense, like the house itself has turned against you. And I think in our current environment and the modern world, we're seeing that the haunted house writ large. Suddenly the country, the people around you are haunted in a sense. There's something that's gotten into them that doesn't make any sense. And they're not acting the way they used to, friends and family, suddenly possessed. So I think that in a modern sense can be very, very frightening. And also in our modern world, a lot of our interactions have become virtual, like this panel right now. And as we progress with this AI dystopian nightmare before us, soon it's going to be very difficult to tell if any of us are real.
Absolutely. That came up also in our science fiction and post-apocalyptic panel too, is deep fakes and what is real and how do we know what's real is real. And to kind of piggyback off of what James had said, I think me personally, one of the most like emotive and immersed game experiences I have had is playing Alice is Missing, where it's all text based and you're teenagers and your friend is missing and you have text chats with each other and you have a group chat and you might be chatting with two people and it's real time and you have these side conversations going, but it's something that we do every day, texting each other, and there's something about that makes it really immersive. Versus, I'm not a history person, I'll be honest. It's not a concept that comes easily to me or that I fully comprehend or invest my time in. So there are plenty of times in games where I Google, when was the telephone invented, so that I know if I can call someone during the time period that we're playing in. And so it kind of leads into our next question. What about modern horror interests you more than classic horror?
I would like to, granted, like this is actually nice segue into it actually, because like I do have like one other theme or trope that might lead into why I like it more. Like I think you also answered the question of like I don't want to Google when something was made so that like it can become relevant. And I was like, oh, we're just like bending time and space because like can we communicate this way? But another trope or favorite trope of mine is, and I don't think it's exclusive to modern horror, but it's done so beautifully in modern horror, is like the person that wasn't supposed to be there or the element that's not supposed to be there. So I think one of the media, which I haven't watched yet, but I love the concept, is Unfriended, which is like a movie where like, hey, a group of friends get on a call, and then there's just this other person that's not on camera that just joined, and who are you? And then someone had like, who are you? And can someone kick them? And then they get kicked, and then they come back immediately afterwards, or they just can't be kicked. And it kind of goes back into the haunting of like someone died the year before or something like that because of something these kids did. So that's an example. Plus, the concept of modern horror, at least from my experiences, are always it's youths going through something in some capacity. They're learning something because like there's things that like life hasn't taught them yet, and unfortunately, they're gonna learn today because it's hard, right? And like those consequences are a lot more harder versus like in not a horror situation where it's like, oh man, I just had a very embarrassing situation. No, you died. Like that was the consequence in the situation, or you get taken over, or whatever the consequence is. But what interests me more than than classic horror, I think, is because it's something that we can relate to and connect with more than anything. I do love classic horror and what like it provides, and I get invested in it in a very different way. But with modern horror, it's something that I can relate to on a very visceral level because the horror creeps in more. I can separate myself from classic, I believe, versus immerse myself in the concept of something that I'm worried about that I wasn't worried about yesterday. I'm worried about now. I was like, oh yeah, deep fakes. That's a thing. How can we make that horrifying, absolutely terrifying? I don't know if I want to think about that right now, this exact moment in time, with all these lovely people on this chat right now. You know what I mean? So like, but I think that's really, I think that's what would interest me more than classic, even though I do love it. I do love classic tropes in general.
Yeah, I was just reminded there by what Ambrose was saying about the Black Mirror episode Shut Up and Dance, which is entirely about somebody's technology turning on them and becoming the enemy. They are blackmailed into performing a series of increasingly more desperate and dramatic acts, which culminates in a really horrible choice for two of the characters to face. And it's all being done remotely. They're all being told to do these terrible things against the threat of what will happen if they don't do it, if they don't submit to this anonymous face behind a screen telling them, do this or have all your secrets exposed. I think there's a lot to be said for the amount of trust we put in the technology and those betrayals of privacy, which are so personally invasive. That it goes beyond, it steps away from that external horror, the horror that's other and out there, and flips it round into the horror that you hold inside. Not the things you're afraid of because you're thinking they might happen, the things you've never thought will happen. You don't think that would ever happen to you. So when it does, that's a completely different level of horror. And that defense we have, that anonymity, that safety is stripped away by a presence online.
I think that's one of the things I really like, especially when we talk about modern horror, is I think Ambrose brought up that we don't have to tell people what they can do in modern horror, or we don't have to teach them how like we live in the modern, like we don't like, there's no like skill. There's like players can immediately get into a modern horror piece. But also it introduces the notion of a lot of stuff that we thought we'd taken care of from just immediate, like even I was just reading some 1950s crime fiction, and the difficulty of identifying a body before DNA evidence, especially a body that taken any damage, and we thought sort of like as DNA evidence emerges, we've taken care of that. But once we get into the modern period, and we realize that our information systems are vulnerable, and we digitize so many of our records, and we trust those digital records, and we don't necessarily always store analog records or make them easily available, that we've now sort of, in a lot of ways, gone backwards in terms of what we can do as GMs. So we also have access to hackers who can replace files in a DNA database or in a fingerprint database. We have access to phone calls. We have access to all that technology too, and we can start messing with the things that people expect to be able to have a lot of certainty about in the modern world when they talk about it, when they think about investigations.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's a certain set of things that people take for granted, and in the past that would have been a different set of things that people kind of took for granted. So when you're playing in historical terms, you know, the musket was a absolutely lethal, dangerous, deadly weapon, and if you had a musket and you had a shot and there was something coming towards you, you could probably kill it. But then you mess with that and it becomes, because people take it for granted, it becomes something that you can't kill something with. So we can do that with modern horror. We can do that with the trappings of modern technology as well. People take things for granted. I have a scenario called Splinter, which is modern day set in on a filming location in the wilds of Canada. And the players go along and they're finding out what's going on, and there's all sorts of horrible things are going on. I won't go into too many spoilers with it, but this is the big spoiler. The problem is colors out of space, and when they get there they find that it's a film crew, so they've instinctively filmed everything. So my twist was, what happens if you film something which is essentially an image, a color itself, and that every time you take a picture of a color out of space, you pop another color out of space, and it creates it's a birthing process. So they go through the whole adventure surviving up there, but if they don't stop the download that's going via a satellite, suddenly there's going to be colors everywhere. And of course, the first thing that people do is they take their camera out, because they're a film crew, and they film what they're seeing. So they're creating the problem. And then people with cell phones, they take a picture of it, they're creating more of a problem. And it's an end of the world scenario without people realizing it's an end of the world scenario. Because if the color gets out back in civilization, now that could never have happened before we had access to digital technology and cell phones and things like that. But people don't think about necessarily the repercussions of the everyday. So people use cell phones every day. They become ubiquitous. They become background. We know what they can do, and we don't necessarily look into the problems that they can cause.
And that's interesting. That's like The Ring, but with YouTube. Yeah. I guess for me, I think this is similar to something Ambrose said. Actually, was I feel in the modern setting, it's much more difficult for you to create barriers for players, anyway, to create barriers between themselves and the character. They're spending less time thinking about what is this character like in the 1940s, and what is the 1940s like, and anything like that. Like, they're basically, all their energy is spent mostly in embodying their character, as opposed to keeping the setting straight. I feel that makes it so it's a little easier to stab them in the back. really get them, and honestly make it hurt, but definitely come at them with surprises, and they're going to feel it, as opposed to them having to kind of go through a couple of steps to understand how they might react to something in a different setting than the one they embody and live in every day.
Go for it.
Kind of piggybacking off of that a little bit, I think, is that I'm trying to find the word for classic horror or classic tropes in general. And I'm thinking about it after everyone talking in general. It's a lot easier to watch classic in terms of like, oh, as an audience member, and taking it in and understanding the time versus being in it, unless you do research and you do know a lot about history and stuff. Of course, you can like just jump right into it, but there's that extra step to do so. But also with classic, I think, and y'all can tell me if I'm wrong here, I apologize in advance. With classic, I think as an audience member or even in it, I can take a better guess at what's happening here versus modern, which is like it could be supernatural, it could be a person messing with me, it could be, and you're just sitting there like, oh hey, as a person that does understand the technology that's being used to like mess with me right now, is it a person like that came back from the dead to mess with this group of kids in a video call because of what they did? Or is it the spirit of the girl that died getting back at them? Or third option that was never even thought of. There's infinitely more possibilities of what is going on here. And the anxiety or like the buildup of that anxiety until you find out what it is more intense, I think, with modern. Whereas classic, it's like, I kind of know what it might be. The anxiety still might be built up, but for a different reason, which is like, when is it going to attack again? When is it going to hurt me again? And how is what I would guess personally.
Yeah, right. Riding on the back of that as well. One of the things that's often said is that the best way to create horror is to take the familiar and make it unfamiliar. Now, when you're looking at classic and historical horror, that's a lot more difficult because of our unfamiliarity. Like you were saying, you check Google to see, can I make a phone call? Is that technology that exists? So you have that removed with the classic and historical horror. But when it's modern, like Ambrose was just saying, you're much more engaged with it because you know something is off. You know something isn't quite right, and you feel it viscerally, and you're trying to interpret and guess and work out, why is this different? What is disturbing me about this situation and the changes within it? Because you also get a bit of the tourist effect with classic and historical horror, where you're just observing, oh, it doesn't affect me. I'm just observing something that these quaint locals are putting on for me. But when it's contemporary, when you're doing something in a modern setting, you lose that layer of protection between you and the fiction, because now you're involved, you're familiar, you know what this technology represents, what lives these people are living. So you don't have that separation, you don't feel that distinct tourist sensation that you get from some classic stories.
And this is a shift about things that are scary to things that make GMing easier. When doing modern horror versus classic horror, is I can put a lot of the research that I would normally have to do for a thing in the 30s back onto the players. Like that, the early edition of Masculine Relative that has all the travel charts and all the travel information and all that good stuff that I would have to like keep communicating to people. And a couple of years ago, ran a great Nike's Black Agent scenario that the players were really invested in, and they did all the research on. They had a timeline, they had a thing they had to accomplish by a certain point, and they weren't exactly sure where they needed to end up. But they could do all that freaking travel information without me having to look a single thing up, because they had the same information that the agents did, and they had them at the table in the palm of their hand. So, like, how long does it take to get to Romania if we go to Prague first, or if we go to Budapest first, and sneak over the border rather than letting people track us going into Romania? So that was all information they could look up, and it's not really that's not really the source of horror itself, but it made my life as a GM so much easier. I could literally just show up at the session and throw them information problems and have them solve them.
Interestingly, it also works. It's the same problems and benefits work when you look forward as well. So if you're looking to science fiction, you've got to still create the world. If you're the universe when you put the horror. We know even less about it because it hasn't happened yet, and it's almost like modern horror is this tiny little sliver where we're okay, and it gradually sort of peters out as we go in either direction, forward or backwards, and things get harder. But I agree, as the perpetual, as the eternal keeper in my group of friends, yeah, modern is my kind of go-to if I've got to put something together quickly, because I don't have to explain anything, or if I have to explain something, it's the tiny change. Everyone's got a tiny superpower, but everything else is the same. I can just say everything else is the way it happens now, and that makes it a lot easier. But yeah.
On the flip side of this, where does modern horror fall short for you?
It's perfect, and I can never betray it.
That's why you're here, right? The love of modern horror.
Oh, okay. I'm going to quote one of the great old ones himself, Scott Dorward, who has on many occasions complained about players who their characters get into a horrific situation completely beyond their comprehension and control, and they go, "We call the police." Which, yeah, when you have power structures in place that are designed to deal with things for you, even if it's as small as like the rat catcher coming down round and dealing with your pest problem, it's difficult sometimes to get people to engage with, like, don't just immediately reach out for an authority that can solve this problem for you or deal with it for you. Try to stay engaged with the fiction. Try to be a character in a horror movie who doesn't think of calling the police. But if you ever get Scott started on that as a subject, he can talk for a long time, a very long time.
I'll have to say, the only time I called the police in a Call of Cthulhu game, it killed the whole party.
Yeah,
because of course they were working with the cultists, so
I came up with a solution for it when I ran a modern horror scenario by just starting all the characters as police officers and saying, "Go on then, see how far that gets you."
Yeah, play the villains.
Oh yeah.
Sorry. I can't do it. When that has ever happened, I don't think it's ever happened in like a game I ran anyway, or like any. I don't think so anyway. But in the concept of calling an authority figure in any way to solve a problem for you, because I'm evil as a GM, I'm like, oh, you think that's gonna save you? You don't know what it is yet. That's so cute. And then like they're also human. It's like, so like they're also squishy. You think that like they don't know what's going on, so like if a cop shows up and then they do their job, they might die too. And that's another thing. Or they vanish, or they disappear as soon as they walk into the haunted house. That you thought it was like, oh yeah, like it messed. Like I love doing that. Where I was like, no, the authority figure can't help you. They don't know what's going on. Kind of situation. I'm having a hard time where it's fallen short myself right now, because like even then I'm like, oh, that would bother me, but then I just grin evilly. I'm like, oh, they don't know yet. Okay. And play off of that. But I would say that I think I have one. Them getting lost in technology, as one does get lost in technology on the day-to-day, right? We're like, oh yeah, screen time, limiting it and stuff like that. Having whole conversations via text message, like as a way to meet up, and then that might get lost a little bit. So kind of reminding people, be in the moment too here. I would say that might happen, or they might get lost in the sauce of technology a little bit in terms of finding out how they can use technology to find out what's wrong. Maybe, but I'll like it's one of those things like a little extra work to like put my foot down as a storyteller. Like, hey, come back to us. It's okay. Or a reminder that like, oh, the more you snoop, the more it's going to notice that you're snooping, kind of situation. So that's the best. That's I would say can get a little irritating, but I love messing with problems and finding ways to like turn it into horrific situations. Just in general.
Yeah. And then
One thing
also
on,
wanted to
oh,
say,
go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't cut you off.
no,
James.
yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that also the familiarity we were talking about before can be a double-edged sword, because when you're setting something in the modern day players that are just very familiar with it, they're much more, they have much more ammunition to use against you. Like I've done things where, you know, the characters have had to go through airport security, and I've just represented it from my own experience of going through airport security. But then you get somebody who goes through it very frequently or who has worked on security side, and it's they go, no, 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 it doesn't work like that at all. No, that would never happen. You would never, and then they can come up with ways to bypass obstacles you thought of or deal with problems that you're trying to present. They just go, oh no, I know a website where you can order, you know, silver bullets from. Yeah, yeah, it's real, it exists. You can just go there and order them. You're like, ah, right. Reality has tripped me up once again. Yes.
Uh, I think that one thing that when player characters call authority figures in, there's both the fact that authority figures are also human and squishy, but also it's a big assumption to think that authority figures are on your side at any given time in any useful way. Like I have one former FBI agent in one Roseville Beach scenario, and she's okay morally, but she's if she's okay, but she's like, you want me to arrest somebody because they cast a spell? That's not a thing that I can book people on. Plus, I can't book people anymore. So there's also just authority figures frequently not on your side. And that's a good response. That's the best response that you could possibly get. I think in Roseville Beach, I used to have in one of the early versions of Roseville Beach, I had a reaction table for calling the cops that included the best possible result was they were just like, sure, and just hung up. They were like, we don't go out there anymore. And I think there's also I think you mentioned with James that it was a little bit of an issue of like sometimes players just know way more about technology or systems or processes than you do, and you just end up sort of flummoxed trying to figure things out. Like, oh wait, I said they did this and they didn't use a supernatural means to do it, but that doesn't actually work. You're right. Sorry. Now I got to think of a different way to have this happen, which can be a little rough on the spot. So, but otherwise, I don't have a reason. I think the only other reason I wouldn't jump in on modern and might choose classic instead is sometimes when you want to use a gothic vibe or a classic suspense vibe, you can sort of overlay that with a set of aesthetics, but it's really kind of a thin layer of aesthetics if they're not sort of living with the reality that kind of those genres grow from.
Yeah.
I think that the downside that I can think of is probably the familiarity, not creating as colorful characters in the players. There's a tendency just to be, I'll be the guy in the leather jacket or whatever it is. And if you put something in a classical period, people will play up to that classical moment. And so maybe a little bit of strength of buy-in, but I mean, I still love it. I do love modern horror. It's but yeah, you need a really good hook. You need a really, really good hook for modern horror. You need something that's going to pull them in beyond. Here are your Edwardian trappings or your Victorian trappings, and or the Mongol hordes or whatever it is you're playing.
I just came up with an idea just now for something to play later. I was like, oh snap! Like, what if it's like modern? Sorry, like this is literally like, here's an idea. What if, and hear me out, is like having a modern setting where people walking and expecting one thing and then just falling into was it like, I think it was in like a Midnight Society where like there's moments of walking into pockets of time, going back in time and losing access to that technology that they would lean on in that time period. And that is horrifying in and of itself, where like you're stuck, you don't know how you got here, you don't have a phone, you don't know how to get out. How do you get out of this pocket dimension or time like slip? Thank y'all. This is magnificent. Just in general.
I will send a pigeon to the local constabulary. And
no, but kind of circling round that as well, I was also just thinking about if we're looking at the weaknesses of modern horror, if they have any, versus the strengths of historical, then in classic horror, your players have some anticipation of how things ought to go. You know, they might not have the familiarity of the details, but they're like, Queen Victoria will take the throne. There will be First World War and a Second World War. So when you're setting things in that era, you have the strength of undermining their expectations. You can play on what they expect up to a point, but then undermine it and pull the rug away from them. Whereas with modern horror, you don't. That isn't a card you can pull out of your deck. You know, it's like, well, yeah, we're all creating our tomorrows all the time anyway. Nobody really knows what's going to come next. So undermining somebody's expectations is a lot harder when everybody's got different assumptions about what's going on anyway.
And I would love to say also, and as a GM, where like they like, oh yeah, I look up a website that like, oh yeah, that like solves the problem that you so carefully crafted for them so that they can get around it. Or like, okay. And I have felt that, but also what I love doing, and I realize later, is there's a consequence to thinking that you can get away with it that way. Like, and it's not like as like a, oh yeah, oh evil GM activate. It's nothing like that. It's, hey, everything has a pro and a con to it. There is a backlash for not going through it this way because, hey, there was a consequence, but a pro to it, as well as this is a pro, but there's a con to it as well. And I love messing with the potential there of like, hey, cool, sure, but like, whatever that might be is like you might get a whole bunch of emails from this location now, or like that might become a potential area of contention later for whatever reason. If I felt creative enough, maybe sometimes I just get away with it and I get irritated and it's fine. But I think that's really intriguing to mess with the potential consequence of getting around the problem, because there's always a pro and con to something.
When we talk about this comparison of modern horror and classic horror, is there a different psychology around what we see in modern horror and classic, or are the innate human fears throughout, or how are they expressed differently between the two?
Well, yeah, I think that, horror, I think, maybe not obviously, but I think that what terrifies us definitely changes through time, and what certain horror elements represent definitely change through time. Like the vampire, let's say, like what Dracula represented in the time of its writing is probably very different than what it represents in the modern era. I don't present myself as a Dracula scholar, but definitely what vampires represent now is very different than what they represented in the past. And I think that's the case for every kind of just sticking with horror creatures. with every kind of horror creature or horror element, whether it's the haunted house or a werewolf. Zombies is a good take back. Like we had that kind of like zombie craze not too long ago, where basically every show on the TV was a zombie show and a spin-off of a zombie show, and there were 3 more zombie shows coming until we had an actual pandemic and we saw what people would actually do when there's zombies around, and suddenly nobody wanted to watch zombie shows anymore because everyone was like, oh well, okay, that kind of takes all the fun out of it. I think that definitely what time you're in definitely twists and changes what things mean in a sense. Like for me, I think zombies kind of represented like this. Often they have a kind of pandemic or disease aspect to me, but me personally, I kind of think of zombies as past these coming back for us, things we thought were dead and buried. Now they're back and they're going to eat us. It's also kind of an allegory for an older generation that refuses to go away and wants to eat everything here, even though their time is long gone and it's our time now, but they're not going away and they're just going to eat their children in a sense. I think that makes for an interesting story, and that's probably where I would go with a zombie story now, but probably not where I've gone with a zombie story, 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the evolution of the zombie story through the decades, because we've gone from like the Dawn of the Dead thing, where it was metaphors for capitalism and consumerism, and then you come up to the late 90s, early 2000s of Charlie Brooker's Dead Set, where the zombies are the audience, the passive consumers of entertainment who are demanding more to be fed to them. And like I say, now we're reaching this point where the zombies are these people that are hanging on. They're if I can say this, but they're a metaphor for the people that we would rather do without, the people that we feel are draining us. They're taking from us, and they're not giving things back, which is a legitimate fear that some people have, and the whole spectrum of fears will get covered eventually. But I think zombies make a good case study for the evolution of a horror theme down through the generations.
And don't forget the brief detour into rom-zomcoms, which I think we can probably all do without. But that was a big ask. I can see how you can romanticize a vampire. I can see how you can romanticize a werewolf with heathlands and full moons and things. But a rotting corpse is difficult to make into a romantic comedy, but they managed it. I think the answer to the question is I don't really know. Is the honest answer? I'm thinking about it. The modern take on horror, and there are aspects that are the same. The source may be different, but the fear. I think the intrinsic fear is probably a similar fear to the ones that were in the past, and a lot of our fears are obviously learned fears, but the things like the evolution of the zombie movie show that those fears that are learned fears do evolve along with us. So yeah, I'm going to sit right on the fence on this one and say I'm not absolutely sure at all. But if you have a good answer, I'm going to nick it.
Can you state the question one more time? Because I think I might have an answer.
Yes. Is there a different psychology around what we see in modern horror and classic horror, or are they essentially the same fears just being recycled throughout the same like base level human fears, or what's the different psychology between the two?
Ooh, yeah, that is difficult.
A hard one.
What Khaldoun said before, in terms of how do you put it? Like something like vampires. I'm tired. I am tired of vampires, but also it does mean something different now. In regards to like imagine Dracula in a castle. The bad thing is right there. I don't want to go anywhere near it. Maybe if I just don't approach it. But there's times when Dracula comes out and does what he needs to do. He needs to feed. So it was the fear of like, hey, how do I prevent this monster from doing what they want to do? And who like how do I not become a victim? There's no way to know not to. It's just going to happen. Someone's going to be taken out is the best way to put it. Same thing with a werewolf where like no one knows who it is. We're cut off. Usually it's like a village or something about the game Werewolf, where not the TTRPG, like the kind of like the 7-Up concept of like everyone close your eyes kind of situation. Who knows who the werewolf is? And there's like that otherness and everyone's isolated. There's no way to communicate or find out exactly. Maybe you don't know how to look for a werewolf because no one taught you about it in general. But when you consider that in modern times where someone is just a vampire in the modern world in a city or a connected town, it's a little easier to get away with things and blend in, even when you have access to those outside forces. I would say that the fear is still there, potentially, but it gets buried a little bit more because it's like vampires aren't real. Come on, like kind of situation. Like just someone's killing people in the town, right? Like it is what it is, and then they're only feeding once in a while. Like maybe they get better at not killing people. It's fine. Like, and then, like, no, like it's buried. It's thought to be urban legend. It's thought to be like, hey, someone just did a horrible thing, and you move on. But then when you are in the same room by yourself with someone that's a vampire, but you don't know if they are, and then they show themselves to you, the horror becomes so viscerally real when you're in a room by yourself alone. And depending on how that story is told, could be very horrifying. So I think it is always there in a baser level, but I think it's buried a lot on top of like, no, vampires aren't real, werewolves aren't real. Come on now, that's just a story. But then when the story is right there in front of you, the horror sets in, and then what do you do about it? So I think it is there at a baser level, but it gets buried with modern a lot more. Whereas cut off from the outside world kind of situation and like rumors spreading and then like, no, it's happening. We're here. We saw it. He's over there. He's in a castle by himself. He's like, like that's, yeah. I think that's it. I'm done talking. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I think you bring up a point of something that I really like about modern horror as opposed to classic horror. And that is we can just accept our pre-existing knowledge as true. Like, we have seen vampire movies, we've seen zombie movies. If you're acting as a person in the, 2020s, 2010s, any of those, that person would kind of accept that as true because media is probably the same. Whereas if I am playing a classical character that maybe you come across someone who's been drained of their blood, I as a player am like, it's a vampire. And that's fun to play with too, where you subvert that and change it, but there are so many preconceived notions in a player's brain about what something can be or is, that you can play both sides of that, where you can subvert it, but as a player, just on a player side, you don't have to pretend that I don't know what a vampire is. What could it be? What is this foul beast that is attacking this town? I don't have to think about that because in my brain as a player, I'm going, it's a vampire. Regardless of whether or not it is, that's just where our mind leads. And so I think that's a fun part of modern horror is that you can subvert that even more because the player doesn't have to pretend like they don't think that that's what it is. They can just say that that's what they think what it is. And then you can stab them in the back with whatever your actual plot is. Stab them right in the heart like you would a vampire.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, sorry.
I was just adding on to that basically, yeah, one classical aspect of modern horror is the like getting over what you believe is real or not is kind of part of the expected trope of the game. It's like, oh, well, those things aren't real, and you kind of have to play along that it's not real until basically it's in your face and like its fangs are bared at you at us. And I feel actually that's also something else we've learned in the past couple of years is that that's just not the case. That people will immediately think it's a vampire right away and go with it. Actually, nowadays they would see the body drained with blood and be like, "Oh my God, there was a Democrat here." Like that's kind of where we seem to be at right now in our world. So it's very clear that people actually are not resistant to believing really ridiculous things with very little evidence. So I feel like we've kind of gone through this experiment, this like global experiment that's kind of exposed some tropes that I've always relied upon as not real. I think we're gonna have to rewrite the book of horror in some ways.
I think one of the things that has changed, I think, in people's fears, uh, I feel like classic horror, there was a justified intense fear of isolation, is in physical isolation. Modern horror is able to capitalize on the fear of emotional isolation. I think a lot more. I think a lot of, and only become more profound post lockdown when a lot of us were sort of at home by ourselves, surrounded by people, frequently within like yelling distance or just on the other side of an apartment wall, but not really able to connect with them. So I think, and when you add technology into the mix, it becomes a sense of like, oh, I can contact all sorts of people for all sorts of reasons at any time of day. But do I want to, or do I want to see them? Will they want to see me? Will I actually have some sort of connection with them? And then when we add our political, rabid, conspiratorial political beliefs to that mix, to add on to what Khaldoun said, it becomes we get even more anxious about our neighbors, whether justified or not. So they will just become sort of monstrous in and of themselves if we reach out to them.
I think the pandemic made zombie movies more real for me, because I think there was a part of me in the past that said, no, well, that's ridiculous, because if there was something this infectious going around, then people would be sensible. Ultimately, they would be go off and they would separate. They would stand 6 feet apart. They would wear a mask. They would do all sorts. And it showed, rightly or wrongly, I'm making no comment about people's personal choices, but it showed me people wouldn't. It showed me that if there was, the same people would be breaking into hospitals to prove that there were no zombified patients in the ward and trying to film them. And it made the whole situation much more real. Also doing the testing centers in the UK, where you drove in and there were people with, in military fatigues holding up phone numbers and things to get tested. It was fantastic grist for a writer's mill. It was an experience. It was in that sense. I'm not saying the pandemic was worth it, but it was worth doing that. But something Miranda said earlier about the tropes, we all know what a vampire is. That's what the interesting thing about modern horror. How much of that information is real? How much of it is Hollywood? How much of it is a story that's been written and taken out of context, and how much of it has come from somebody's imagination? We all would have some sort of idea how we would deal with being in a room with a vampire, but whether that information is accurate and would actually have any kind of effect, I think that's where the modern twist on that would come from.
Yeah, I think it's very informative to look at modern creations in horror, the monsters that are emerging and the way stories are being told. So things like Slender Man, the SCP Foundation, analog horror like Local 58 and the Backrooms. As we've been saying, we know what a werewolf is, we know what a vampire is. We have a thirst for things that aren't explained. So we're creating things which are inexplicable, which are still to be investigated, where nobody can have an absolute knowledge of it, to take the place of the overfamiliar, overused classic monsters of horror. The zombies, the vampires, the werewolves are too well known. The horror's been deadened, if I can use that word ironically. We're looking for things which we don't know, which aren't yet understood, which still have creative space for us to fill in our own fears and scribble that interpretation on top of them.
I think we touched on this a little bit, but I feel like one of the most commonly cited reasons for staying classical, for not going into the mid-90s, into the prominence of cell phones, into the internet, those are the reasons why people stay in that classical era and stay out of modern horror. They don't want to deal with people being able to call the police, call anyone they want, look up anything on the internet. I know Ambrose had said something about like being so engaged with your technology, and we're so used to, if we have a question, you can just Google it and then you know the answer. That's all the investigation that you have to do in life, is just Google it. And how do you, so a lot of times they eliminate those from the equations. A scenario might have the powers out. There's no cell service where you're at. You're at this cabin in the woods and you don't have access to these things. But how can you, instead of trying to tiptoe around these things that you don't want to have to deal with, how can you blend modern technology, phones, internet, and into your games and harness it to make things more horrific for your characters?
I love doing that. Like, just in general, like, so these are frustrating things, but what I don't see it as a tiptoeing around it. Like, it depends, to be fair. Like, oh yeah, like you're in a cabin in the woods, there's no cell service, right? But I use mechanics a little bit in regards to like, what did you find if you're Googling something? Maybe you Googled the wrong thing kind of situation, unless like there's a way to up your score for whatever reason. But I would say that like leaning into the horror using technology, or like I said before, where it's like, hey, maybe you can't fully trust it depending on what the horror is, right? So if it's something that utilizes you using a phone or whatever, or technology or the internet or a computer or anything having to do with that, you decide to mess with the trust that the player has in those things instead. But if that's not what is being used or utilized in that regard, you kind of need to get like, they enter the situation or the story with like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna Google it. Like, I'm just gonna like check out the rating on the Airbnb of this cabin in the woods kind of situation, and like, oh, I'm just gonna like see the previous tenants and what happened to them kind of situation, and they have that trust in it. And then you realize that like, oh, this listing is no longer, doesn't exist anymore. So like, oh, so then how did I book it? Like you took it away from them. So now like, oh, I can't trust this. Now I have to think with my brain here in this situation. How do we get out? Do we just get in the car and leave? That could be an option. Like, let's just leave right now. I'm like, oh, okay. Like you can just leave. Yes. But like you already like trigger the trap of being here. So it's going to be harder to get out of the situation. It's possible though. Or you can investigate and find out what's going on. Or more than likely, no one's going to want to do that unless they have to be forced to do so. So yeah, like for me, it's just like, hey, you can use it. You can like build the trust of technology, but in this situation where the horror is right here, it might not be in your best interest to do so. It's there still. You can trust it outside of the situation, but not right now, I would say.
I like to build the horror into the technology. I like to put the horror right into it, make the technology part of it. I don't see any reason why beings that exist outside of the usual space and time continuum wouldn't be able to use the internet for its own uses, even without any kind of sentience. It could just be a creature that's built. Some of the things I've touched on earlier, use the trappings of modern technology to create the horror, at least as much as you're creating the horror outside of the technology. Make it an equal partner, so you're not tiptoeing around it. It's solidly part of the horror universe that you're building. It's there, and it has to be dealt with. The trust in it is definitely eroded as soon as someone starts. You get in your car to drive away, and you put your sat nav on, and your sat nav takes you all the way back to where you've just come from. And so now you can no longer trust the sat nav. Your cell phone is talking to you in a language you don't understand. There are calls coming from numbers that are not recognized from anywhere. Whatever it is, build it into. You make the technology part of it. If you were looking at horror in the past, and the advent of the revolver, or the steamship or something, you writers created horror which used that, rather than it being something you had to avoid and find a way around. Don't think of it as finding a way around it. Think of it as you've been given more grist to put through the mill to make more horror. Sorry, I'm sounding a bit soapboxy, aren't I? So I'll climb on down now. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, thanks to Anthony, I think I'll write something with the Duolingo owl as an old one now. I think that's a scenario, possibly an entire setting waiting to be written, actually.
Or that paperclip thing. That's yeah. definitely
Oh, well, you don't have to write that. That's just fact. Like, that's clearly like Azathoth or something. But no, yeah, I would agree that making the technology part of the horror can be half the fun. I don't personally, when I'm writing or running things, I don't like to strip players of their tools or whatnot, or their magic items or anything along those lines. But I do find the tact of making it unreliable or part of the problem can be very useful. I wrote on a book called The Second Inquisition a while back, and part of that basically really delved into the surveillance state, and basically how technology today is being used to surveil us and to make assumptions about our behavior and who we are, whether we're vampires or humans, or what political thoughts we may have just upon our virtual behavior, and what an authoritarian power, how they could use that information once they've made those assumptions about you. And so I feel that can be part of the horror if you want it to be, if that's the kind of oppressive setting or situation you're looking to put your players into. That can be very difficult because when you're in the modern setting, you want to use the trappings of the modern world. It can be very difficult to put players in a situation where they're afraid to pick up a phone, afraid to send a text, never want to go near email, which actually that's just the truth in my what I find. Nobody wants to go near email anymore. But when they don't want to interact with the modern world, that can be difficult. So I think there is a balancing act there. You don't want to make it so oppressive that they're basically hiding out in a cave and lighting fires with sticks and stones. But I definitely think it having a hint of danger, so they have to, in a sense, gamble, risk. Is it worth it to make this phone call? Is it worth it to take $20 out of this ATM here, because then they'll know. And I think just putting that seed of doubt in their mind heightens the tension, and just puts another thing in play that they worry about, and then they don't notice the Hound of Tindalos or whatever hiding in the phone booth.
Yeah, and if I can steal the soapbox from Anthony for a moment, this is one of my personal, very passionate things about when I'm GMing any game is I love the players to have the information they need to act effectively through their characters. So like the classic and historical, I actually find ties my hands a lot because like I've got a plot here and I need to give them these pieces of information. I need to find a conduit by which they can get this information. They've just if it's modern and they're carrying a phone around in their pocket, they can just go, I'll just Google it. Brilliant. Here you go. Here's all the information. Because there's two types of information you'll get in a typical game. One is the stuff the players need to act effectively, and the second is just all the colour and fluff and the improv you do when they ask you a question you weren't expecting. So give it all to them. Give them the whole jigsaw puzzle. Take the jigsaw box, tip it upside down on the table in front of them and say, here's all the pieces. Now solve it. Yeah, so the modern technology is great for opening up those channels of communication. And if anything, flooding the players with information. It's like any question they ask, here's an answer. What are you going to do with it? Where does it fit into the picture you're building? It's beautiful. I love it when they ask a question, not expecting me to tell them and just go, nope, yep, he's the murderer. Now prove it for the satisfaction of everybody else.
Something
think-
really
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Okay. No, I'm gonna shout out someone a little bit for using modern technology in a scenario, and that's John Hedge, who wrote Alpaca on the Plane, Alpaca in the Coffee, various Alpaca games. But I played in one of his games recently where he has an email set up so the players you can send an email to this email address and get a reply. He has an Instagram set up for something that's in his game, so he'll go to he can tell you to go to the Instagram, and I feel like that was a really interesting way for him to use modern technology to make the game more immersive so that the players can actually interact with technology, and it would seem like a very easy way to do that, and was just something that I remembered and came to mind, and I kind of wanted to shout that out, that you can even use technology as it is in real life to bring your players in more.
I think one thing that's really interesting to use in modern horror, and I think I started thinking about this when I was listening to Magnus Archive's early seasons, and they would draw on this I think Bosun's Call, their episode about the container ship that goes missing and the crew that sort of big portions of the crew that disappear, is really tapping on some of the older or more analog technologies that sort of govern we hide away and try not to think about. Like so much of our modern life we think of as being digital, but it relies on these people who work in intense drudgery to supply to maintain our global shipping systems and our global communication system. And the things that can happen to those people, that unless it's a wreck in the Suez Canal that blocks global shipping, we just generally don't think about it. We have insurance that covers like anything that goes missing at sea. We've got shipping insurance. We get new ones in a very brief period of time. For a while, lockdown sort of screwed with those shipping systems, and the Suez Canal sort of screwed with those shipping systems. But unless something is actively screwing with it in a way that causes more than just you and a few other thousand people scattered across the globe to have issues, we generally don't think about it. But we are aware of them. And the nice thing, and those have always existed, but we're very aware of how they sort of function in our modern world. So it doesn't take a lot to activate players investigating or starting to investigate them but it's hard for them to get other people in the scenario activated about like, oh, this container ship went missing, or the part of the crew went missing, or it sunk. What was on that container ship? And most people are going to that sounds really sad. I don't know what to tell you. So it's a lot of those things that we could screw with that are holdovers from a classic world where we're not just magically transporting things. There's this invisible group of people that we don't think about doing those, and you can sort of. I thought of that because Magnus Archives did that Bosun's Call episode so well. But it's one of those things that is kind of a background of modern life that allows everything else to function.
I think it would be a real shame not to mention Laundry Files as a game that incorporates modern technology into, or at least fairly modern technology into the game, the books as well as the RPG. The idea that science and maths is very similar. You can have an iPhone, or is it a Necronomicon he calls it, or the Jesus phone, and you can install apps which can create wards. It's a good source for the sort of modern technology usage within a horror environment. And the other thing is, I think we can all agree the real fear is that the 1990s was 30 years ago.
I had the pleasure of seeing Back to the Future, the musical, last weekend, which now, yeah, and as people were saying, it's like, yeah, if that was set today, if that was taking place now, Marty McFly would only be going back to 1994, and instead of playing rock and roll, he'd be playing house music. And you're like, oh, I could do without that.
Time is the original elder god.
I know we've kind of covered a lot of different challenges just as various different pieces, and we just talked about technology being one of the ways that I see or hear people not wanting to delve into modern. They want to keep it, they see classic as being simpler. But what are some other challenges that come up when running or writing horror in a modern setting, and what are some like interesting ways to overcome those obstacles?
I'll bring up something I like to do in a lot of scenarios, which I think is quite often lacking, a- apart from some very specific old classics, and that's to use the family as a stepping stone to the horror. Um, Games like Quietus are very good at doing small, intimate horror stories. Um, and I know I'm going a bit off topic from the question you specifically asked here, but I did want to bring up the family angle because I find it really like my favorite thing to do with creating a set of characters to play in a scenario is to make them related. Parents and children, or cousins. Just anything that instantly gives players that hook into the drama, because then the horror can be something that's taking place within the family. It's the secret that has been passed down. It's the place in the country that we don't talk about. Grandma's old house that we remember from our childhood, where something terrible happened, but we've suppressed it since then. Um, the challenging side of it is sometimes getting players to embrace that, to just accept your two characters are related. You've known each other for years. You're not strangers. You have a shared history. Feel free to bring that in. Now, for some players like to have everything written down for them, to have a complete character briefing where they can just, oh, did we go for ice cream in 1986? It doesn't say on my character bio. But yeah, if you can get players over that hurdle of just going, you are family. You would have a shared history. You would know each other. It's beautiful when people just get that, and they'll just suddenly throw in something like, "Oh yeah, this is just like that time I fell off my skateboard and you put a bandage on my knee." And just if you can get players to throw in those little details themselves, like, draw on their own experiences. I think that's the strong thing about using family as well. If you're okay with it, if you can manage the bleed, draw on your own experiences, reinterpret them, and offer them up as grist for the mill again. Something to throw into the drama. It is bringing players forward to have the confidence to use those kind of techniques, though. That's the challenge of playing characters who already have an intimate, deep relationship with each other.
Well, and just modern versus like family dynamics are so different now than they have been in the past because of all of the invents of the modern world. And I work with teenagers, so I know a little bit about them, but just interacting with them and how they interact with adults and with parents, and communication is constant and ever present, whereas there are eras where you wouldn't in the 90s you send your kids out and come home when the lights come on, and now there is a constant form of communication. You got your kid on, or your parents or anyone on Live 360, and you can see where anyone is at any given point in time. And I think there are some fun ways to play with the anxiety of that. The anxiety of not knowing when we actually know everything all the time, and can check on it and can see where people are and text, what are you doing, and expect an answer back right away. So that sometimes you have to lean into that unknown and make the usually known unknown, make it different somehow. And I think family's a good place to do that, because family looks so different now too than it has in the past.
I think as well, society in general has changed. So you can the differences between the two. There's a lot of social isolation in our society today, and it's not geographical. It's the person next door. I mean, people don't always know the names of their next door neighbors, or the people across the street, or they know their next door neighbors, but they've never spoken to the people across the street, and they could be very strange. Whereas in the past, we tended to live in smaller groups where people knew each other. And I work in mental health support, and a lot of what we do is creating environments that are actually mirrors or artificial versions of things that used to occur naturally in societies. People would gather around someone's table and talk out problems, and now people don't do that sort of thing because we don't go into each other's houses so much, and we don't know the people on the floor above. And the differences we have are profound, but sometimes less obvious. It's sexuality, gender, race, color, language, politics, things that aren't always immediately obvious to people. And I think you can play with modern society a bit. You can play with the socialization. If you put a really economically downtrodden area next to a rich upcoming area, which happens quite a lot in the UK. You have these areas where they're being redeveloped, and they're very, very expensive, but you've still got old 1960s council estates, which are still blocks of people, and that they rub against each other. And those things are things of much more trappings of modern society, where problems can occur because there's nothing actually to stop people moving backwards and forwards between them. Whereas in the past, perhaps your social rank or your social status prevented that. They were still there, but you didn't interact with them unless it was part of a professional thing. Whereas now there's nothing to stop you. You can go to the same pub, you can go to the same bar, the same cinema, and that rubbing against each other can create interesting environments.
Yeah, if you want to find a ghost town in the modern world, go to the south of Chelsea in London and walk through the Thameside estates. £1 million apartments, which are just owned as an investment. The only people you will see there are the workmen who are employed, the workers who are employed to be groundskeepers. Nobody lives there. You can walk through, not see a soul, lights on in all the apartments, nobody at home. It's quite eerie at times.
Yeah. And how often do they hear a shout, a scream, or a car alarm or something, and people don't look? People don't. Perhaps in the past people did, and they heard someone shouting. They went to see, but they don't. So isolation doesn't have to be geographical, putting players in a place where they, for whatever reason, their nature makes them outsiders from from the people around them. Then when the police turn up, when they've called the police, you've got a really good reason as a ref to go, yeah, the police really aren't paying you much attention because you're in the wrong side of town. You're the wrong person in the wrong place. So the police aren't really interested in you. So that can be an area where you can change with modern society.
To follow up on that, it is amazing how many portions of New York, one of the most densely populated city in the United States, you can be alone in a 2 or 3 blocks. You can be the only person on one of the most densely populated and with the highest pedestrian traffic. You can still find yourself absolutely alone on the streets of a busy neighborhood like Williamsburg, Brooklyn. There are people in businesses or in homes not very far from you, but you're the only person on a sidewalk that you can spot. And that can be its own kind of eeriness, is knowing other people are in the vicinity, but you're not among them. And I think one other thing to play with, I think, about relationships and social isolation is how this changed around 5 or 6 years ago, but how we are frequently much more emotionally connected to people we work with than to people we live near, which also means that we have a much more emotionally intense relationship, whether it be hostile or affectionate or at least familiar, with somebody who lives in a radically different part of the city or even in the suburbs, kind of far away from us, than we do with our actual neighbors. So you have emotionally connected relationships, but they are very dispersed from you because you're used to sort of going to see those people and then all going back home. And you spend 8 intense hours a day with them, but then everybody goes back in radically different directions. And that can also add to that sense of urban isolation.
Yeah, so with the last few minutes that we have, I'd love to kind of get just pull back out and do a bit of an overview. I'm a GM that I've only GM'd modern, or not modern, 1920s, 1930s Cthulhu. Maybe I've only existed in the fantasy realm of RPGs. And I know we started with the what question, but I would love to hear from each of you kind of as we wrap up the panel, why modern horror? We can start with Anthony. We'll just go around the table.
First of all, is there any way to change the sequence of people? Because I get to go first a lot. Why modern? I think familiarity. I think the lack of a need to really explain too much to people. You only have to explain what's different. I think complexity. I think the complexity of modern life can create interesting situations. And I think the difference that you can create between what's real and modern and what's horrific and modern, the drop off is really sharp. Whereas if you're comparing it to something in the 1920s, which we don't have as a baseline, the horror is just another thing that's a bit different because the 1920s are already different for us. So that that would be my three things.
James?
Like Anthony, the accessibility you get through familiarity. But also one of the things I think a lot of GMs would find is beneficial is the restraint it puts on players. I have had players who thought it was perfectly fine for their character to walk through a city carrying a box of dynamite in case they needed to use it, which maybe in the late 1800s, early 1900s somewhere, okay, that's eccentric, but you could maybe get away with it.
Was it Matt Sanderson?
Not this time, but it was a friend. But yeah, you try that in the mod. As soon as somebody came up with that as a suggestion of something the character would be doing in a modern game, it would just be like, No, I don't think so. No. So yeah, it's nice to just like the familiarity makes it easier to communicate the nature of the game to players, but it also instantly puts that little conscience in the back of the head, kind of going, no, your character probably wouldn't do that. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. Again, it's like I was saying before. It's the tourist effect. It's getting away from just being an observer of events and actually being part of them. And I think bringing it into the modern era really plants people firmly. Their consciousness gets more firmly planted into the story, and they more intuitively understand what the characters should or shouldn't do, or can and can't do.
Yeah. Khaldoun?
Well, for me, I guess the main thing I like best about modern horror is the why is it lets me, whether as a writer or a player, more often as a writer or a storyteller, explore larger issue problems that we're dealing with in the world right now. Like in a classical setting, you can do that as well, but it's more allegorical or metaphorical. While in a modern setting, you can kind of tackle those issues head on. Well, not usually head on, but often in a metaphorical way. But certainly in a modern setting, it seems more pertinent. As I said before, I often like to think of my villains or my monsters as representative of something else, whether thematically or narratively, and that's what the players are pushing against. Yet again, to go back to vampires, if I was to use a vampire and just said to you, "Vampire Elon Musk," you would immediately know what kind of game we were playing, and the adventure would write itself. I would just say that in my head, and I could run the adventure. And I find that basically, if you just take a monster and then the name of a billionaire, put them together, you will come up with a fantastic adventure. So that's 4 hours easy every time. And that lets you explore, I feel like a modern issue pretty easily. Like Frankenstein, Jeff Bezos. I mean, come on. I mean, it's so easy. It's almost criminal.
Richard?
I think it's partially something that that was talked about earlier, is that you can sort of just, I think James said, you can just dump all the information out and let them start sorting through that. But also your antagonist and rival NPCs who are also trying to like solve the mystery or for their own ends have so much access to information about the players. I recently had players like pull in their broken rental car into an investigation spot to kind of kick off a liminal horror mystery. And an NPC with law enforcement connections was able to quickly get, see their license plate, figure out where they rented it from, what name they rented it under, who the authorized drivers were, and get all sorts of information about them that was added a level of creepiness to the adventure, because suddenly they were known and seen and sort of exposed.
Fantastic. And Ambrose?
Why modern horror? Why not modern horror? No. Modern horror is a thing that means a lot to me personally, because it is a lot easier to connect with. It is a lot easier to be pulled into the visual, to be pulled into and be present there, because you're in it. You're going through life through the modern day without horror applied, and then having a lens shift because of an unknown that was bought in, a horror that was bought in. I think that's very powerful, um, especially with the right GM, with the right storytelling, with the right setup, with players that just understood the assignment entirely, and telling the story together is a very powerful situation. There is like a beauty in classical, of course, because I love watching it and participating in it, what I know I'm getting into. But feeling how I feel in a modern day setting and seeing the horror creep in that way, whether the universe is everyone knows that creepy stuff happens all the time, or no, creepy things aren't a norm here in the city. And seeing that and being a part of a conspiracy, or being a part of like a, hey, oh, I just saw a peek through the other side of the mundane, like from the mundane to the other side, I think is very intriguing and powerful, and it draws me in every single time. So I say, why not modern horror, y'all? Like, why not do that? Like the possibilities are endless. In my opinion, it is vast and it grows depending on what we deal with on our day to day. Like the pandemic being something that hit hard in a different way, and realizing you don't want to ask that what if sometimes. Kind of what Anthony said was like, people would know better than to, like make reasonable decisions in regards to, and then you're proven wrong. And what a feeling that is to have that set in your stomach of like, wow, I didn't really want to ever ask that what if, but what if blah. I think, yeah, bottom line, I think it's really powerful, and it is one of my favorite horrors. And there's so many subgenres that you could apply to it or layer on top of it. So yeah, it's the best.
You heard it here, folks. Why not? Why not? Why not modern horror? Just do it.
What are
If
you
you haven't
doing?
done it yet, do it. Do it. Do it now. Go play a game.
What
Do
are
it
you
now.
sitting and waiting for? Do it.
Go write it down. Yeah, be in
All
the
the
live in the
cool
now.
kids are doing it. You're missing out.
That's right. Yep. Peer pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well-
go, shoo. Why are you still here? Everyone.
Why are you still
You've got,
here?
like Ferris Bueller.
We'll go back. We'll go reverse order this time for Anthony, and give our just name, where people can find you if they want to hear more from you. Where do you live online? I mean, not like in person.
No.
But where can they?
Where do you
Where can
live?
they find you?
Oh,
Where
no.
do you personally? I have things to send you. We'll start with Ambrose.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ambrose. I go by she, they pronouns. I'm the creative director and founder of Othersider Studios, where it is home to the Arcane Core series, which is a modern horror, investigative horror series using the Monster of the Week system. I am a award-winning TTRPG performer. You can find me as SS Ambrose _ on Twitter and Instagram, because those places hate me. They decided that I needed to put underscore in order to be relevant for some reason. But everywhere else, I'm SS Ambrose. So please check me out. And I feel like I'm missing something, but yeah, y'all have been lovely. And come check me out whenever you can. Yeah.
Richard, we'll go with you next.
Hey, I'm Richard Ruane. I use he, him pronouns. You can find me online as Rook Studio, no spaces, no dashes, pretty much on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads. I'm the creator of Moonlight on Roseville Beach, a game of queer and cosmic horror, and the upcoming Haunting of Cliff Cove, which is on Kickstarter right now. And I think that's all for me. Oh, if you find yourself in South Williamsburg and see the Hasidic section of South Williamsburg, you are not far from me. So feel free to reach out on social media, and I might even respond.
Fantastic. Khaldoun?
Yes, my name's Khaldoun Khelil. I write for RPGs and such. You can find some of my work on Drive Through RPG, the Storyteller's Vault specifically. I developed and wrote on the Black Hand playing the Sabbat. That's the main book I have on there. You can find me on Twitter at Khelil. So I mostly talk about politics there, not some game stuff, but mostly politics and the rest. Yeah, you can find my work around, and I'm recently become the narrative director for the Vineyard RPG. And, be sure to check that out, especially the adventure anthology, and that's me.
Awesome. James?
Yep, I am James Mullen. Groundhogger is kind of the brand name I have saddled myself with. You can find a lot of the small, strange games I experiment with on itch.io, on the Groundhogger page. You'll find me on Facebook, on Mastodon, on the Dice Camp server. I'm also a moderator on the Powered by the Apocalypse Discord server, where if you join now, we are currently looking at Monster Hearts in our monthly reading group. So if that's something you want to talk about or know more about, please come along and join in the conversation there.
And last but not least, Anthony.
Hi, I'm Anthony Lee-Dudley. I sometimes throw my middle name in there, so I have first names, but usually I just go by those three that I have. You can find me on an enormous number of Discord channels. I have a Discord problem. I just click yes to when people say, "Oh, come and join the Discord." But we can with good friends, obviously, and the MUP Discord, some of my favorites. You can find some of my work from Chaosium. I wrote in Sanitarium for the most recent actual play campaign. And you'll find my scenarios, articles, and short stories in Hypergraphia magazine, Proto-Dimension magazine, Blasphemous Tome, of course. And I think I'm on Blue Sky as well, but I can't even remember what name I put down. So I'm there as well. But you'll find me on Discord. I'm pretty much one with the system now.
And I'm Miranda. You can find me most of the time on Discord as well, on the Good Friends of Jackson Elias, The Old Ways. I'm a storyteller and cast member on the Old Ways podcast. And on most social media, I go by Don't Stop Me Now. So you can look for me there. And I really appreciate everyone that is tuned in, everyone that's listening to this recorded, and I hope you check out or enjoyed this, and also check out the rest of the panels that we have for A Weekend with Good Friends. Thanks.
Thank you.